History of Texas. Episode 2, The Narvaez Expedition. Somewhere along the Gulf Coast, starving Spanish conquistadors melted down their own armor to build crude wooden rafts. The horses were dead. The maps were useless. And somewhere beyond the endless swamps and forests of Florida, the expedition of Pánfilo de Narváez was collapsing into one of the greatest disasters in North American exploration history. But to understand how they ended up there, we need to go back to Spain. By the early 1500s, Spain was expanding rapidly into the New World. And after the conquest of the Aztecs by Hernán Cortés, Spain became obsessed with conquest. Men who had once been minor nobles, mercenaries, or second sons suddenly returned from the Americas with wealth and status beyond imagination. The conquest of the Aztecs had changed everything. Suddenly, every unexplored coastline seemed like it might hide another empire. The Spanish crown, under Charles V, aggressively encouraged new expeditions into the Americas. But Charles V was not merely the King of Spain. As Charles I of Spain, he ruled Castile, Aragon, Naples, Sicily, and Spain's growing territories in the Americas, including Mexico and the Caribbean colonies. And, as Holy Roman Emperor, he also controlled vast territories across Europe, including parts of modern Germany, Austria, Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, and northern Italy. Through dynastic inheritance, the Habsburg Empire stretched across much of Europe and the Atlantic world. By the 1520s, Charles V ruled one of the most powerful empires on Earth. And yet, somewhere beyond the Gulf of Mexico, rumors persisted of even more lands waiting to be conquered. But here's an important detail many people miss. The Spanish crown did not fund expeditions like a modern government operation. Instead, conquest in the New World functioned more like a dangerous public-private partnership. The crown provided legitimacy, royal approval, and legal authority. In return, Spain expected territory, wealth, and loyalty. But much of the actual risk fell upon the conquistadors themselves. Men like Narvaez invested their own money, recruited followers, secured ships and supplies, and gambled everything on the possibility of striking gold, claiming land, and rising to power. This was a high-risk, high-reward venture. Find wealth and become powerful beyond imagination. Fail and die somewhere far from home. This system explains why so many expeditions were poorly planned, dangerously ambitious, and constantly on the verge of collapse. These men didn't come to survive. They came to conquer. And few embodied that mindset better than Pánfilo de Narváez. Now, Narváez had already built a reputation as a hardened military officer during the Spanish conquest of Cuba between 1511 and 1513 under Diego Velázquez de Cuellar. Capable, ambitious, and ruthless, he quickly became exactly the kind of man Spain liked sending into dangerous frontiers. But before Texas, before Florida, Narváez had already suffered one of the most humiliating defeats of his life. In 1519, Hernán Cortés launched his campaign against the Aztec Empire, despite operating with questionable authorization from Spanish authorities. In response, Narvaez was sent to stop him. In 1520, Narvaez landed on the Mexican coast with nearly 900 men under orders to arrest Cortés and take control of the expedition. Instead, Cortés attacked first. At the Battle of Zempoala in May of 1520, Cortés launched a surprise nighttime assault against Narvaez's forces. Narvaez was defeated, severely wounded, lost an eye, and was taken prisoner. But Cortés did not kill him. Executing a royal officer could have caused serious political consequences back in Spain. Neutralizing Narvaez was safer than turning him into a martyr. And in perhaps the greatest insult of all, many of Narvaez's own men defected and joined Cortés after the battle, strengthening the very army they had been sent to stop. Eventually released and returned to Spain, Narvaez did not fade quietly into obscurity. Instead, he regained royal favor and secured approval for a new expedition, one that would carry his name into history forever. In 1527, Narvaez sailed from Spain under orders from the crown to conquer and govern Florida. But Florida was not simply another unexplored coastline. To the Spanish crown, Florida represented something far larger. Control of the Gulf of Mexico, protection of Spain's growing American empire, and the possibility of discovering another wealthy civilization like the Aztecs. Now, by this point, silver, gold, and treasure flowed constantly across the Atlantic toward Europe. The Gulf of Mexico and Caribbean Sea had become the lifeline of Spain's empire. And Florida sat directly along the northern edge of that world. Narvaez's goals were classic conquistador objectives: to find gold, establish settlements, expand Spanish power, and convert the local peoples to Christianity. So, Narvaez, eye patch fixed firmly to his face, and a chip on his shoulder the size of the Atlantic Ocean, departed Spain with roughly 600 men to begin what was, in many ways, a crown-approved freebooting venture into the unknown. Among them was Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca, whose writings would later become one of the most important early accounts of Texas and the American Southwest. The expedition sailed first to the Canary Islands, then across the Atlantic into the Caribbean. But, even before reaching mainland North America, the expedition was already beginning to unravel. Desertion became a growing problem, as many men who had dreamed of glory in Spain began realizing the dangers ahead of them. Then came the storms. The Caribbean battered the expedition with violent weather that destroyed ships, scattered supplies, and killed men before they had even reached Florida. By the time Narvaez finally landed near present-day Tampa Bay in April of 1528, morale and logistics were already collapsing. Still, the Spaniards believed they stood on the edge of another Mexico-like conquest. Instead, they found swamps, dense forests, mosquito-infested marshes, and powerful tribes who had absolutely no interest in being conquered. The expedition encountered peoples associated with the safety harbor culture and nearby chiefdoms, such as the Tocobaga. Narvaez badly underestimated nearly everything: the terrain, the distances, the climate, the supply situation, and the resistance he would face. Even so, the Spaniards marched inland carrying steel armor, crossbows, primitive firearms, horses, war dogs, priests, and royal banners. To them, this was supposed to become another glorious conquest for Spain. Instead, they had landed in one of the harshest environments imaginable for a European army of the exploration age. At first, relations with local tribes were cautious. There was limited trade and communication through gestures, but tensions escalated quickly. The Spaniards constantly demanded food and gold, took captives to use as guides, seized supplies, and interrogated villagers about wealthy kingdoms farther inland. And, repeatedly, the tribes pointed them onward. Always further north. Always toward another supposedly richer land just over the horizon. The Spaniards kept marching deeper into Florida, chasing rumors that never materialized. Then came the fatal decision. Narvaez split the expedition. The ships would continue sailing along the coast, while the army marched inland, with plans to reconnect later. It was a disaster waiting to happen. Florida's rivers, swamps, and forests made navigation incredibly difficult. Communication between land and sea became nearly impossible. Once separated, the expedition effectively shattered into isolated pieces. The inland march quickly descended into hell. The conquistadors pushed through swamps, pine forests, rivers, marshland, and suffocating subtropical heat. Their heavy armor became torture. Food shortages grew severe almost immediately. The Spaniards had expected rich settlements with storehouses of grain and tribute systems similar to those found in Mexico. Instead, they found scattered villages with limited food supplies, many of which had already been abandoned before the Spaniards arrived. Starvation began to spread through the expedition. Men killed horses for meat. They raided villages, scavenged shellfish, dug for roots, and struggled against exhaustion and disease. And the deeper inland they traveled, the more resistance they encountered. Tribal warriors used ambushes, hit-and-run attacks, and intimate knowledge of the terrain to wear the expedition down. Spanish firearms struggled in wet conditions. Horses weakened in the swamps. Heavy armor slowed movement to a crawl. Men drowned crossing rivers. Others died from disease or arrows fired from the forests. Some became too weak to continue and were simply left behind. Eventually, the expedition reached the territory of the Appalachee near modern Tallahassee. Narvaez believed this might finally be the wealthy kingdom they had been searching for. Instead, they found small villages, limited food, and fierce resistance. The conquistadors briefly occupied one settlement, but they were effectively trapped. Appalachee warriors harassed them constantly. Cabeza de Vaca later described arrows falling daily into camp. And slowly, the illusion died. There would be no second Mexico. No great empire. No mountains of gold. Only starvation, exhaustion, and an increasingly desperate struggle to survive. Eventually, the expedition attempted to retreat south and reconnect with the ships. But they could not find them. Imagine the psychological collapse. Starving, wounded, lost, surrounded by hostile territory, with no maps and no idea where the fleet had gone. Morale absolutely shattered. The men had crossed an ocean in search of glory, only to find themselves starving and lost in a land they did not understand. And many were beginning to realize they had purchased themselves a one-way ticket to hell, and yet somehow things were about to get even worse. And that is where we'll leave our brave conquistadors for now. Next time, we'll follow Cabeza de Vaca and the surviving members of the expedition as desperation drives them toward one final gamble, a desperate last-ditch attempt to build crude rafts and escape the Florida wilderness alive.